In today's age, we're taught from the age of about 10 about the sheer evil of colonialism. We're told of stories of rape, pillaging, but most importantly, how colonialism is at fault for all the pain and suffering Africans have to endure today. Now, I'm one of the few who is willing to say all those who jump on the politically correct bandwagon that preaches a message about white guilt in regards to colonialism is severely misinformed. While I'm not denying the fact that European colonialism had some adverse effects on the African continent, colonialism was ultimately a positive for the continent. Note how I'm exclusively talking about colonialism in Africa. One might wonder why I'm doing this, since colonialism was experienced by Native Americans, Indians, Pakistanis, among other groups. Well, that's because when one talks about colonialism, they generally are discussing Africa. So without further ado, I present colonialism was good for Africa. Now this video will be divided into three distinct sections, which are pre-colonial Africa, colonial Africa, post-colonial Africa, and South Africa, which ties into that last section. So let's start with the basics, that is, pre-colonial Africa. With the exception of North Africa, who had fairly structured societies, most of Africa was tribal. South of Sudan, even in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were no wheels, no cattle, no real buildings, no effective governments, and no nation-states. Hell, there wasn't even a written language in most of these states. Now, as discussed in an earlier video, this is evidence of the intellectual inferiority of Africans, but I'll stop myself before I go off on a tangent. Anyways, tribal war was common, females treated ruthlessly, and few had remotely decent life expectancies. Furthermore, there was little to no clean water, no sanitation, few truly organized towns, etc., etc. Now, keep in mind that I'm talking exclusively about sub-Saharan Africa. Once you reach countries like Libya, Egypt, Morocco, such countries have fairly high average IQs and a history of relatively structured societies. I mean, we've all heard of the pyramids. So, while one might call Africa today gross and disgusting in regards to standard of living, we must remember that most portions of Africa were doing far worse under pre-colonial society than they are now in post-colonial society. Far, far worse. Hell, why do you think the British and Dutch colonists popularized the idea of white man's burden? This basically means that it was the burden of white men to civilize and improve the lives of Africans. Many colonists believe this. To call them monsters, and them, I mean colonists, is grossly false, as many colonists actually had desires for a more prosperous, developed Africa. Now, granted, there were some real assholes who raped and slaughtered innocents in Africa, and I will not justify their actions. I cannot justify their actions. And adding on to my previous point, I cannot stress enough how common tribal war was, and how low the life expectancy and standard of living was. It was unreal. Do you know why our history classrooms never cover sub-Saharan African history? Not because of a white bias and privilege, but because the only things discussed would be slavery, a lack of civilization, mass tribal warfare, etc., etc. I'd rather study classical European and East Asian culture. Thanks. Then Europeans began colonizing the continent, primarily in the 19th century. Now, we must remember that aside from North Africans, the Africans were completely isolated from the rest of the world. As I said, there were a few exceptions, near Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, where Portuguese and Spanish settlers had visited centuries earlier, but hadn't established super well-ingrained colonies yet. Now, when the Europeans arrived, it is true that they did begin to ship some people off to the Americas to be enslaved. I'm not ignoring this. However, one must remember that slavery was just as common, if not more common, under pre-colonial Africa. Furthermore, many Africans bartered items such as liquor and coconuts to ship off their own people to slavery. Africans were equally at fault for the slave trade, since it was a lucrative business that wealthier Africans benefited from. Others did not benefit from this, so please don't misconstrue what I'm saying, as I do not support slavery. Slavery is grotesque, and any civilization, or any society that wants to call itself a civilization, cannot have it. Outside of some colonies in West Africa, the slave trade was relatively unheard of, and the Europeans began establishing new states throughout the continent. The governments, or these governments, built roads, hospitals, bridges, sanitation, schools, popularized Christianity, for better or worse, among so many other things. Now, no longer did blacks have to poop in a pile of leaves thanks to the introduction of the toilets. Hell, proper buildings were built so natives didn't have to hide under thatched roofs when thunderstorms came. Hell, written languages were given to the Africans. Gone were centuries of illiteracy. Of course, learning written language was tough for most natives, so languages such as Afrikaans were created that were so simple that natives in Africa could learn them. Plus, by the late 19th century, the slavery was mostly gone, if not entirely gone. There were attempts by British, Dutch, French, and Spanish colonies to integrate Africans into a new civilized Africa. This had some positive effects, but the native Africans had troubles integrating into a more globalized world. Then came bloody civil wars, revolutions, and the like, where Africans gained their own nation-states. After World War II, most European nation-states went through the common collective conclusion that colonies were of no benefit, though these nation-states, European nation-states, were ultimately wrong. By the mid-20th century, most colonies became independent, and for a brief moment, Africa was optimistic that a brighter future laid ahead. It didn't. Most post-colonial nations descended quickly into genocide, civil war, oppression, and mass poverty. While Africa is doing better than it was before colonialism, gone are the days of passable societies full of somewhat developed infrastructure and societies. It's depressing. However, some countries, such as South Africa, weren't too keen on giving up white minority rule. In 1948, South Africa, which had a minority white population, enacted apartheid. While South Africa had been politically dominated by whites for decades at this point, apartheid was kind of a beginning of something new, as it was the African equivalent of segregation. Blacks, though a majority in the country, were not allowed to vote and were excluded from some public services under apartheid. This policy was enacted by the National Party, a right-wing party representing Afrikaner interests. Now, Afrikaner people, despite the name, are not black. They are whites descended from the Dutch. In South Africa, they are sometimes called Boers. Now, South Africa maintained the system of apartheid until 1994. That year, universal suffrage was granted to the whole populace, and Nelson Mandela, an icon for anti-racism, became the new leader of South Africa. Under apartheid, South Africa had high living standards compared to all the other countries in the continent, had a sturdy rule of law, developed infrastructure, and a government that wasn't destructive and reckless. And when I say destructive and reckless, I mean this government actually gave a damn about the livelihood of their black residents. Apartheid ended a little over 20 years ago, and now South Africa is one of the most corrupt, the most unequal, one of the most crime-ridden, if not the most crime-ridden nation in the world today. Afrikaner people are leaving in droves to find a better life. Perhaps it would have been best if South Africa didn't abandon apartheid? Anyways, unless I go off on a tangent, I think I'll make another video specifically about South Africa, especially considering the fact that there is a little-known genocide against whites going on there. Google it. The BBC and CNN refuse to report the topic, but thousands are dying as a result of it. And you know what? Perhaps Africa would have been better off as a whole if it was still under colonial